Segment 1: The Human Condition and the American Experiment. Welcome to the show. We're going to start somewhere truly fundamental. Think about this. When you woke up this morning, did you sign a contract? Did you choose your time, place, or even your species? No. You, me, and everyone around us, we simply found ourselves here. We were born onto a planet hurtling through space, a cosmic anomaly. The sheer fact of our existence is an involuntary lottery win, and this core truth that none of us consciously chose to be here is the foundation for everything that follows. And a lot of us are privileged in that we were born into families that live in the USA. For the first few 100,000 years of our existence, there was no government, just survival. Imagine the day of a solitary caveman. Every calorie is fought for, every night is a risk, every task hunting small, fast game, or finding a dry cave is done alone. There is no infrastructure, no social safety net, and certainly no debate about tax policy. But then came the paradigm shift, the realization that if humans collaborated, we could achieve things impossible for any one person. This collaborative leap didn't happen overnight, but anthropological evidence suggests that as early as 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, groups of early Homo sapiens began to cooperate on specialized tasks that required more formal social structure. One person can kill a deer, 10 people can take down a mammoth. This isn't just anecdotal, it's a cold, hard efficiency calculation. An average mature deer provides about 60 to 70 pounds of edible meat, maybe feeding a small hunting group for a few weeks, or a whole village for one single meal. Now, compare the effort. A deer can often be taken down by 1 or 2 hunters with a relatively low-tech spear. A mammoth, by contrast, required the highly coordinated effort of probably 15 to 30 skilled hunters, extensive planning, specialized tools, and a high risk of injury or death. But the reward was exponential. The mammoth could yield thousands of pounds of meat, fat, and bone marrow, a return on investment potentially 100 times greater for the group. This difference illustrates the simple, undeniable efficiency gains you achieve when you work together. If working alone was the best way to achieve your goals, we would all still be living in caves and cooking our meals before dusk by an open flame. This collaborative effort wasn't driven by idealism, it was driven by pure self-interest and efficiency. Human needs are constant. We require sustenance, safety, and shelter. When operating alone, satisfying these needs is a full-time, high-risk job, but cooperation creates a crucial efficiency known as specialization. One person could become proficient at flint-knapping tools, another at tracking game, and a third at building more robust shelters. By pooling these specialized skills, the total amount of effort required to sustain the community decreased dramatically, while the overall quality of life and safety increased. This simple, undeniable efficiency, where 2 people doing different things achieve a result far greater than 2 people doing the same solitary task, is the bedrock of all human civilization. Crucially, this specialization deepened as the world became more complicated and our needs evolved. When humans lived in solitude, the goal was simple: survive the day. But as we formed larger societies, our needs expanded to include things like reliable long-distance trade, permanent architecture, and complex defense. These new challenges required entirely new skill sets that the solitary caveman never even conceived of. You needed the metallurgist who could turn rock into bronze for superior tools, the engineer who could calculate the stresses on a bridge, or the navigator who could chart trade routes across vast waters. This constant evolution of human requirements is what forces the continuous need for complex, capable governance. Example of evolved complexity. The need for government quickly evolved beyond simple physical defense and resource allocation. For example, once we had specialization, we needed rules to protect the abstract intellectual output of that specialization. The solitary caveman didn't need copyright law, but the 19th century inventor needed the US government to create the Patent and Trademark Office. Imagine being that inventor. You spend years in a cold shed, pouring your life into a revolutionary machine. You finally succeed, but without government, the moment you show it to the world, a larger, richer competitor can simply copy your design overnight, leaving you with nothing. Your idea, the most valuable resource in a civilized world, is stolen. Protecting that resource required a massive, complex legal and administrative apparatus. Here is the efficiency of capable governance, the enormous bureaucratic machine required to arbitrate, grant, and protect every single American invention. The Patent and Trademark Office equates to less than 3 cents per person per day from the total U.S. population. For what is effectively a few dollars a year, every single citizen can rest assured that there is a civil mechanism in place to protect their intellectual property. Without a mature government capable of policing ideas and abstract property, economic innovation collapses. The sheer complexity of modern life demands continuous, mature oversight of things that aren't even physical. Progress wasn't just possible through cooperation, it was the only way to dramatically increase the reward-to-risk ratio of existence. One person can dig a shallow pit, 50 people can build a permanent, fortified village. Progress required cooperation. But as groups settled and populations grew dense, cooperation got complicated and, frankly, a little messy. Think of it as the original homeowners association. You might not mind if a lone caveman steals a berry from you, but when he's your next-door neighbor in the fortified village, his impulse control becomes your problem. That's why simple, fundamental rules quickly emerged. Don't kill your neighbors, and don't steal your neighbor's berries. Because without these basic agreements, society collapses into chaos. But rules are useless without an enforcer. You need an established organization, a central authority, responsible for sorting out the inevitable disputes and ensuring compliance. This is where governance formally took root. The imperfect science of governance, evolution, and trust. Governance, however, is an imperfect science. There is no ultimate rulebook for how a government manages the most fragile resource of all, the people's trust in its own system. To remain legitimate, a government must do two things continually: evolve and maintain trust. The need to evolve. As we've seen, complexity never stops increasing. The system established 200 years ago must constantly adapt to regulate technologies and social issues the founders never imagined, from the internet to gene editing. A mature government must be flexible, constantly replacing old rules with new ones as it discovers better ways to manage the public good. But since no one official can be aware of every issue in a vast population, the government must rely on intelligence gathering, consulting scientists, running statistical models, and polling to get a true temperature of the public's needs and concerns. The erosion of trust. When people stop believing the system is evolving fairly or effectively, trust erodes. They begin to withdraw, refusing to engage with that system, and eventually start to want it to be fully replaced. What could erode trust faster than seeing the chaos we're seeing in the American system today? The constant gridlock? The performative dysfunction? This is why the structure of the American system is so novel and vital. It provides formal, mature mechanisms for continuous evolution. We, the citizens, contribute by voting on issues and by voting for our representatives, whom we bless with the opportunity to do the hard work of evolving our system of governance at the local, state, or federal levels. As we have seen from examples so far, our current structure of governance has to be well equipped to regulate abstract concepts like ideas and property. That's a gigantic task. And it is because the job is so immense that while we do successfully vote, it seems simultaneously obvious that we may be sending people who are not as qualified as we may have originally thought. Ignorance is expensive. Historical case studies for the skeptics. Now, the skeptic might say, look, I agree in principle, but politics is ultimately about values, not balance sheets. Does deep policy knowledge really matter? For those skeptics, we turn to the hard evidence of history, because ignorance in governance is always expensive, often costing lives and trillions of dollars. Case Study 1. The Ignorance of Monetary Policy. For decades leading up to the Great Depression, America's monetary policy was locked in a bitter, ignorant debate over the gold standard and the nature of currency. One side, driven by half-truths and fear, believed money had to be backed by gold. The other, slowly informed by nascent economists, argued for a more flexible supply. This wasn't just a political squabble, it was economic ignorance institutionalized. The rigid adherence to the gold standard exacerbated nearly every major economic panic from the late 19th century through 1933, plunging the country into deep, prolonged recessions because leaders simply didn't understand that the value of money is based on trust and stability, not the physical quantity of a yellow metal. The sheer misery and economic stagnation created by this ignorance required decades of learning and painful legislative fights to resolve, proving that economic ignorance directly leads to economic devastation. Case Study 2. The Human Cost of Regulatory Ignorance. Another chilling example lies in the era before federal consumer protection. The debate over regulating food and drugs in the early 20th century was initially fought by politicians driven by half-truths and a naive belief that industry would self-regulate. They lacked basic knowledge of chemistry and public health. This ignorance allowed manufacturers to sell snake oils, dangerous preservatives, and tainted meat. It took scandals like the discovery of rat feces and ground-up glass in food and widespread death from unregulated pharmaceuticals to shock Congress into creating the Food and Drug Administration, FDA. The conflict wasn't ideological, it was a battle against ignorance. The political system only created the mature, complex machinery of the FDA after the human cost of legislative ignorance became undeniable. These examples prove that the conflicts we debate are not always matters of irreconcilable philosophy. Often, they are simply battles against ignorance and short-sightedness. Mature, intelligent governance anticipates these catastrophes. Immature governance waits until the bodies pile up and the economy collapses before grudgingly hiring the experts. The core theory of governance. To truly appreciate the gravity of the American system's current failure, we must consult the fundamental literature on governance. Political philosophers generally agree that successful government hinges on three non-negotiable pillars. The first, and most foundational, is the monopolization of force, national defense. If we cannot protect our borders and maintain domestic order, no other rules, laws, or debates matter, because tomorrow another entity will simply impose its rules upon us. The state must alone hold the legitimate right to use coercion, police, military to maintain peace and order. The second is the social contract and legitimacy, the philosophical understanding that the governed consents to be governed, trading some personal freedoms for collective security and benefits. This is where the American experiment lives. Finally, the third is the provision of essential public goods and utilities. This requires maturity and intelligence, as it involves making difficult, technical decisions for the collective benefit. This isn't just about building roads, it's about providing things that are non-excludable and non-rivalrous, like a stable currency, a universal legal system, and access to essential utilities like power and water. While many utility sectors are run by private corporations, they are often heavily regulated. Contrary to the cynical belief that regulation is about control, it is fundamentally a matter of ensuring equity and fairness. Government regulation ensures that essential resources, the things necessary for modern life, are equally accessible and sold at a fair price to every citizen, regardless of their zip code or wealth, preventing private monopolies from prioritizing profit over public welfare. These elements, order, legitimacy, and public benefit, are the objective metrics by which we must judge any system. The American system designed to provide these pillars not through authoritarian decree, but through the hard, mature work of democratic consensus. Crucially, the fact that our government has such rigorous regulations in certain areas, like the safety standards for bridges, the purity of water, and the fair pricing of electricity, may lead people to believe that this is the way government operates across the board. In fact, it does not. The government only applies such heavy regulation to ensure society can operate on a day-to-day civil basis, the foundational non-negotiables like public safety and universal access. Outside of those essential services, the system relies on the chaotic, innovative power of the free market. This surgical approach requires an even higher level of intelligence, the maturity to know precisely where to regulate and where to let go. Our government does not heavily regulate every coffee shop or every app developer. It only regulates, or tries to find the fine line that is as hands-off as possible, but with the mandate to provide the foundational infrastructure necessary for those coffee shops and app developers to exist civilly. The difficulty of the fine line. The simple fact is that finding this fine line is the single most demanding intellectual task in modern governance. It is not enough to simply draw a regulation. You must determine the precise point where regulation protects everyone's self-interest without becoming overbearing to the innovative spirit of the market. This requires immense intelligence and labor. Legislators must break down complex, multi-layered policy ideas to figure out where the real, structural disagreements lie versus where the purely emotional or performative ones are. They must then determine to what degree those real disagreements are truly irreconcilable. Consider the challenge of net neutrality, a policy governing how internet service providers treat data. A mature government must weigh the free market's desire for tiered service, which drives revenue for expansion, against the foundational civic need for equal, unfettered access to information, which drives innovation and equity. Getting this balance right demands not charisma, but deep technical literacy, patient negotiation, and the maturity to compromise on the mechanism while protecting the core principle. This need for a stable enforcer led most countries down a predictable path. Throughout human history, power was rarely shared. It was typically inherited, a ruling family, a powerful king, or a centralized religious authority, the people already in charge. The vast majority of nations across the globe evolved from this model of top-down governance, where power starts at the apex and flows downward to the citizens. If we look around the globe today, we see the sheer variety of solutions humans have devised to manage the complexity of human civilization. Across much of Asia and the Middle East, for example, systems tend toward authoritarianism, where power is consolidated, often providing rapid, centralized stability at the expense of individual liberty. In parts of Africa and Latin America, we see a high frequency of hybrid regimes, governments that retain democratic structures like elections while struggling with entrenched autocratic practices. The historical pattern is clear. Top-down power is the default setting for human organization. truly stable, functional liberal democracies. Systems defined by the free flow of information, robust civil rights, and peaceful shared power remain concentrated primarily in North America, Western Europe, and parts of the Pacific. Systems that rely on high levels of trust and compromise are the global minority, the missing ceiling. When you observe even the most stable, efficient systems of top-down power, like an authoritarian state that builds incredible infrastructure, you realize one fundamental element is missing: the capacity for true, self-directed evolution. In these systems, power held by the people has an absolute ceiling, defined by the ruling elite. The government can improve and adapt only as fast as the unelected leaders allow it to. But in the United States, that ceiling does not exist. We hold the ultimate power to dictate how we want to govern ourselves, continually evolving the rules and the system in response to our needs. This is one of the reasons that everyone in our system should be extremely wary and skeptical of Trump's calls to eradicate the Democratic Party. We need to avoid giving any one group absolute power, because in effect we will also be placing a ceiling on our own ambitions as a country. This power is the ultimate expression of collective maturity and the reason why we cannot look for external sources to blame. We have the tools to fire and replace underperformers. This freedom is a colossal, challenging responsibility, and it forces every citizen to become introspective and analyze whether or not we are truly doing enough to vet the representatives we are voting into office. It is against this backdrop of historical difficulty and global complexity that the American experiment began. The concept that ordinary citizens would govern themselves, establishing systems of checks and balances, is one of the most remarkable, paradigm-shifting ideas in world history. We, the people, would be in charge of the rules, all of them. And for a long time, the results were incredible. The stability created by this system fueled unprecedented economic growth, technological leaps, and military strength that defined the globe for a century. This wasn't magic, it was the result of a system built to force a certain level of mature negotiation and intellectual sobriety. Consider the Interstate Highway System. Passed in 1956, this was not a partisan victory. It was a decades-long bipartisan commitment to long-term economic strategy and national security. It required the maturity to plan 20 years out and the policy intelligence to manage a multi-billion-dollar engineering feat across 48 states. And here's a crucial point. No leader ever could have accomplished this based on their gut feeling. To build that system, thousands of intelligent people had to decide everything from the minimum width of a highway median to the maximum grade allowed for a 4-lane road in every single state. And all those decisions had to be made with some level of clarity before they could put a shovel in the dirt. This required a mountain of data, engineering expertise, and the humility to delegate decisions to experts. A competent government is not one that rules by charismatic whim. It is one that rules by sober data and the tedious necessary details. Or think of America's great acts of global altruism, actions of profound collective maturity. After World War II, the Marshall Plan helped rebuild former enemies, creating stable trading partners and democracies. In the 1960s, programs like USAID were created, not for immediate national gain, but to administer development and disaster relief globally. They focus on specific, selfless achievements, like improving child survival rates, managing major health crises, e.g., smallpox eradication, HIV/AIDS response, and promoting economic self-sufficiency in developing nations. These were moments where leaders prioritized generational outcomes and global stability over immediate political wins, demonstrating national maturity and selflessness. The founders knew that the only way for the system to survive was if the people sent their most capable, thoughtful, and pragmatic leaders to manage it. The results were incredible because the standards for governing were, for a time, incredibly high. The attributes of a great representative. So far, we've already established we need one another to accomplish amazing things. We need rules to maintain civil society, and we need a group that is the enforcer. Most places in the world, these foundational choices are already made. In the USA, we make the decision every 2 to 6 years, depending on the role. We choose who will represent us at every level of our government. Before we get to the specifics of our argument, let's identify the universal traits of great leadership. We expect them to have vision, the capacity to see not just the immediate situation, but the long-term potential of the nation. We demand integrity, the unwavering moral consistency that assures us they are serving the public, not themselves. And we require courage, the will to take difficult, unpopular votes when they align with the national good. But even those traits are not enough. It seems apparent to me that the current crisis is rooted in a fundamental lack of two, more specific qualities that are necessary for the collaborative work of modern governance: political maturity and policy intelligence. First, political maturity is the ability to prioritize outcomes over ego. Maturity is humility. It means having the security to admit you might not have the best idea, and allowing the opposition to score a political win if it results in a tangible benefit for the public. Maturity is impulse control. It means restraining the urge to post the immediate, angry, viral response on social media, and instead waiting to formulate a substantive, intellectual counter-argument. The real job is the quiet, complicated work of amending bills in committee, not the televised shouting match on the floor. Second, policy intelligence is not about having a high IQ, but about policy literacy. It is the minimum required competency to understand the levers of power. Intelligence is depth. It means understanding the complex relationship between deficit spending and inflation, or the intricate logistics of supply chain management. An intelligent politician can discuss the mechanisms of a policy, not just the slogans. Intelligence is context. It means understanding that every proposed solution has an unintended consequence, and they spend their time preparing for those consequences, not denying they exist. The mouthpiece problem. The unfortunate result of this vacuum is that many frustrated citizens, tired of stalled progress, have started voting for people who aren't even going to Washington, D.C. to solve problems. They are electing mouthpieces for a radical ideology, representatives whose primary job is not to govern, but to deliver a consistent, unyielding message of ideological purity. This trend, over the last several decades, has fundamentally degraded the functional capacity of our government. If we continue sending less intelligent, less mature politicians, we will only get worse, more chaotic solutions, or worst case, no solutions at all. Yet, the idea of sending someone simply more qualified and more mature, someone whose focus is competence over charisma, is rarely the rallying cry. The power of self-correction, speed as a function of maturity. The reason this competence gap is so terrifying is that it fundamentally breaks the system's ability to self-correct. People tend to get hung up on a specific law or executive order, and they get angry because they instinctively know if this was a mistake, how long will it take Congress to fix it? When Congress is at a standstill, the answer is forever. You extrapolate that delay and realize that the system is no longer flexible. But that's not how things need to be. Our system is designed to be highly flexible. A cooperative legislative branch can make decisions instantly when warranted. Votes can happen quickly. The most valuable output of a mature, competent Congress isn't perfect legislation. It is the speed of adaptation. A government full of intellectually humble problem solvers would be trusted to make a bold move, knowing they would be ready and willing to fix their mistakes within weeks or months if the data proved them wrong. When we lose the ability to self-heal quickly, every piece of legislation becomes a permanent, existential threat. Wouldn't it be so much nicer if we could feel comfortable when Congress makes a bold move, knowing they have the maturity and competence to reverse course if necessary? The current system's inability to adapt is a direct result of the immaturity we allow. When we view the gridlock through this objective lens, a failure of maturity and intelligence, the entire picture changes. Now, let's look at Washington. That great experiment is currently defined by standstill, chaos, and celebrated legislative defeat. The common diagnosis is partisanship, but that's too simple. We believe the experiment is failing not because of irreconcilable ideas, but because of a simple, core failure in skill and character. The crisis is one of maturity and intelligence among our elected officials, and we as the electorate need to man up and admit that we're sending the wrong people to try to get stuff done. Segment 2. The electorate as CEO, the broken hiring system. We've spent a lot of time defining what governance should look like. Now, before we point fingers at the current chaos, we need a fundamental shift in perspective. I think we should stop looking at Congress and the executive branch as our leaders, and start looking at them as our employees. You see, the term leader implies deference, that they are the experts and we are the passive audience. But under the American system, that is fundamentally wrong. We are the sovereign entity. We, the citizens, are the ultimate CEOs. The people you elect, your representatives, senators, and even the president, they are the C-suite hires responsible for managing a multi-trillion-dollar company called the United States of America. In any successful organization, disagreement is inevitable, and it is healthy. That's how better solutions are forged. No two intelligent, mature people will ever agree on the perfect highway median width or the exact right spending allocation. Conflict isn't the problem, it's the failure to manage conflict with maturity and competence. When a major company starts failing, when progress halts, when essential services like funding the government shut down, and when the executives, Congress, spend all their time throwing tantrums and refusing to collaborate, who is ultimately responsible? It's not the workers, it's the management that hired them and failed to enforce performance standards. Right now, we are faced with the staggering reality of constant, crushing gridlock. things that should be simple, like keeping the government open, become theatrical, career-defining crises. This isn't because the policies are irreconcilable. It's because our hired executives lack the maturity and intelligence to find creative solutions where all parties gain something, but also all parties must give up something, that painful, necessary act of compromise. It should be obvious to us now that we, the people, are failing at our primary job, picking our representatives. We have people posing as qualified leaders, people who may be excellent at rhetoric, fundraising, or even basic policy knowledge, but who have no ability to function within a multi-party system that demands humility and negotiation. Instead, they weaponize immaturity and ego to demand total ideological victory. In any private company, executives who sabotage their own enterprise through ego and personal vendetta are fired immediately without severance or ceremony. We need to take a step back and reassess our fundamental assumption. We have to question whether the people we are putting in these positions are actually qualified for the incredibly complex, technical, and mature job we are asking them to do. If a candidate cannot demonstrate the essential traits of maturity and intelligence, we need to treat them not as an ideological rival to be defeated, but as an unqualified applicant who must be rejected. Painting this picture, the electorate as the demanding CEO is the only way to help people visualize how vital their role is in selecting our national staff. This leads us to the heart of the matter. How did our hiring system break down to the point where it actively screens against competence? Segment 3. The path to unqualification. The systemic incentives. So how do we, the CEO, allow our hiring system to produce this reality TV Congress? The system is designed to reward the worst behavior. This isn't a theory, it's a structural breakdown rooted in the incentive structure of modern politics. The primary problem, the siren call of the extreme. Think about the path to Congress. It runs through a low turnout, high ideology primary. This is a crucial math problem. In many districts, the primary turnout might only be 10 to 15% of registered voters. The candidate's core mission, therefore, is not to find broad, unifying consensus, but to pass a purity test dictated by that small, highly motivated fringe. They must appease the extremes, the small, most fervent base who demand simple, angry declarations and zero compromise. A candidate who boasts, "I negotiated with the other side and got 70% of what I wanted," is often seen as a traitor or a weakling by the primary voters. Conversely, a candidate who proudly announces, "I prevented them from getting even 1% of what they wanted," is rewarded as a hero of ideological purity. The entire selection mechanism structurally rewards extremism, inflexibility, and emotional rigidity, punishing the very maturity and humility we defined just moments ago, the media incentive, the outrage economy. The second structural force is the modern media and social environment, which has completely flipped the job description. In the mid-20th century, a politician's career was built on effectiveness within the closed-door committee room, the ability to read a 500-page policy brief and write a competent amendment. Today, it's built on virality and outrage. The short-term reward for a 15-second soundbite where you trash your opponent, make a personal attack, or manufacture an inflammatory narrative is immediate and massive. Millions of clicks, shares, a spike in fundraising dollars, and instant celebrity status among your base. The system measures performance by digital noise. Now contrast that with the long-term consequence of that immaturity, a gridlocked, dysfunctional government that fails to solve problems. That consequence is slow, diffuse, and happens far away from the camera, only hitting home when your specific policy fails. We've created a political economy where being an effective, quiet legislator actively hurts your career trajectory, and being a professional antagonist is the fastest path to re-election. The incentive structure punishes maturity and elevates the spectacle. It asks candidates to be reality TV stars, then expects them to be responsible engineers of the nation's infrastructure. The money treadmill, governing as a distraction. Add to this the need for constant, massive fundraising. The quiet, thoughtful people, policy experts, successful business leaders, and dedicated public administrators often avoid Congress because the job requires spending upwards of 30 to 50% of your time on the phone begging for money. This treadmill favors candidates who are masters of generating outrage and fear, because fear and outrage are the most efficient and effective fundraising tools in existence. The ability to write a detailed energy bill is irrelevant compared to the ability to craft a terrifying fundraising email. The quiet, complex work of governing is sacrificed for the constant pursuit of cash, diverting time, focus, and intellectual energy away from the core job description. If a politician is spending 4 hours every day in call time to satisfy donors, they are losing 4 hours of potential time. They could be spending reading the policy they are about to vote on. This structural demand for constant financial victory ensures that true policy intelligence is relegated to staff, while the representative focuses solely on the performance necessary to refill the war chest. In short, the structural incentives of modern American politics are a factory for immaturity and incompetence. We have outsourced the selection process to the loudest, most extreme voices and the algorithms that reward them. It's a structural crisis. Now, as the CEO, let's talk about how to screen our employees. Segment 4. The Voter's Due Diligence. Setting a Standard. It is time to stop outsourcing our frustration. We are the employers. If we keep hiring bad employees, the fault eventually comes back to us. We need to become the high-expectation voter. This means replacing emotional validation with a rigorous, cold checklist. Here's how you audit your candidates, starting with what real maturity and intelligence looks like. The qualification checklist, testing policy literacy and maturity, policy depth. We must demand that our representatives articulate the mechanism of their solution, not just the goal. When a candidate talks about healthcare, for example, do they immediately address the specific funding streams, the regulatory changes required at the federal and state level, and the anticipated long-term economic consequences? Or do they just promise better coverage for everyone? Vague slogans are the telltale sign of a lack of policy intelligence. We are looking for paragraphs, not platitudes. We demand to know how they intend to operate the complex machinery of the modern state. Executive experience. We are not electing a cultural pundit. We are electing a manager of trillions of dollars and hundreds of federal agencies. Has the candidate successfully led a nonprofit, managed a substantial budget in the private sector, run a large organization, or served effectively in a substantive local government role like mayor or city council? Look for irrefutable proof that they can handle complexity and compromise when real money, real logistics, and real people's livelihoods are involved. If their only experience is giving speeches, they are unqualified for the administrative role of government. Intellectual humility. This is the core of political maturity. Look for the absence of personal ego in their approach. Has the candidate ever publicly admitted they were wrong, or demonstrably changed a core policy position based on new, undeniable data from a reputable, nonpartisan source? Intellectual maturity means having the security and confidence to admit that you don't know everything, and that the best ideas often come from the other side. Humility is the absolute precondition for compromise. Long-term focus. Does their political vision demonstrably extend beyond the next election cycle or the next fundraising deadline? Mature leaders are willing to take heat today from their base for a generational benefit tomorrow. A vote for responsible infrastructure spending that takes a decade to realize, for instance, is a mature vote. A vote driven solely by the fear of being primaried next year is a vote that fails the long-term focus test. Unqualified leaders simply chase the next poll number, while mature leaders plan for the next generation. Identifying underperformers, the complaint-only politician. Most citizens would probably say they lack the tools to differentiate the qualified from the performer. But the truth is, their underperformance is visible every time they address the public. We must bring the story back to a first-person perspective. Imagine you asked an employee, "Why did you fail to complete that major project?" How would you address it? With a list of excuses or a solution-oriented narrative of steps taken? The complaint-only behavior. The immature, unqualified politician always addresses the public by making their complaints known, detailing how the other side is obstructing them or how the process is unfair. They use vague, rhetorical language. They refuse to negotiate. They are ruining the country. This is a crisis of their making. These representatives never talk about the specific, incremental steps they have taken to try and achieve consensus. They are essentially saying, "I failed, but it's their fault. Please accept this poor excuse and rehire me." The test of specificity. A qualified, mature politician can always provide a solution-oriented narrative. They don't just say, "I want to fix the border." They say, "I spent 3 weeks in committee attempting to amend Section 4 of the bill by offering compromise language C, which would have increased funding for drone surveillance in exchange for a streamlined asylum hearing process, but my motion failed 10-date. Here is my next move." That is the language of a worker who is trying to solve the problem. The hiding tactic. When a representative cannot provide that narrative of incremental, effort-filled steps, they are behaving immaturely and hiding behind the public's generalized discontent. They assume we will just accept their emotional excuses and blame the other party because we haven't given them the high expectation audit they deserve. This is definitive evidence of an underperformer. The failure is not ideological, it is a simple failure of professional competence and character. Actionable due diligence. 5 steps to objectively audit a candidate, read the paper trail, go beyond press releases and campaign highlights. If they are an incumbent, look at their official legislative history. We are looking for an interest in complex, constructive policy. Did they sponsor bills related to supply chain logistics, municipal finance, or infrastructure planning? Or is their track record dominated by a long list of symbolic, self-congratulatory bills that never had a chance of passing? If they are a challenger, use their public CB to look for relevant administrative or managerial experience, not just TV appearances. Analyze the debate maturity, mute the sound, watch a full, unedited town hall or debate. Then try watching it with the sound muted. Just observe their body language when their opponent is speaking. Do they smirk, roll their eyes, constantly fidget? Or do they maintain composure and listen respectfully even when they disagree? The way they treat a political opponent in a controlled environment is an objective indicator of how they will handle a national crisis, with ego or with sobriety. Check the disclosures. Review publicly available financial disclosure forms. You don't need to be a forensic accountant, but you need to check for glaring, unaddressed conflicts of interest. Do they hold stock in companies that would directly benefit from legislation they are currently proposing? This quickly reveals whether they prioritize public service or personal financial gain, which is a test of character and long-term focus. Evaluate the issues page depth. Go to their official campaign website's Issues tab. If the issue descriptions are one-sentence emotional bullet points, they are selling spectacle and relying on sound bites. If the issue description is detailed, costed, and contains specifics on implementation, they are selling competence. Compare the depth of their policy plan to the depth of their opponent's attack ads. Look for the experts. Does their campaign feature endorsements and reliance on serious, non-partisan policy experts, former government administrators, or industry professionals? Or does it rely exclusively on highly partisan campaign strategists, social media influencers, and TV pundits? Qualified candidates seek wisdom from deep experience. Unqualified candidates seek victory from shallow spectacle. In short, we have the tools to demand quality. We can look past the rhetoric and demand competence, but this leads us to the most uncomfortable question of all. Segment 5. The Crisis in the Mirror, the Emotional Core. We have spent our time so far meticulously dissecting the problem. We built a philosophical fortress proving that governance is a supreme act of collective maturity and intelligence, a monumental social contract that protects us from chaos, fire, and cholera. We then established an objective checklist, a standard of policy literacy, executive humility, and long-term focus, and we saw how the modern political system actively rejects these traits, trading them for viral noise and ideological purity. We have identified the cause of gridlock. It is a failure of character and competence in Washington. We have identified the solution: elect high-expectation candidates. But there is one final, necessary step, and it is the one you will hate the most. It requires you to set down the politician's checklist and pick up a mirror. The uncomfortable truth, the reflection. Why does the system keep producing the very thing we despise? Why, after railing against chaos, do we continually reward the loudest, most chaotic voices with our votes, our attention, and our dollars? The simple, devastating answer is this: our politicians are not the anomaly, they are the reflection. The crisis in the Capitol is not an alien invasion from a separate political class. It is the grotesque amplification of a maturity crisis in the electorate. You see the politician on the screen, eyes rolling, shouting down an opponent who is trying to speak about the mechanism of a solution, and you instinctively categorize that politician as an immature baby. And yet, when that politician scores a cheap, viral insult or refuses to concede an inch on any debate, you cheer. When you cheer, you are telling the political marketplace, this is the maturity I demand. This is the intellectual rigor I will reward. The politician you elect is simply your worst, most selfish, most uncompromising self, wearing a tailored suit and given a microphone to make noise. We have outsourced our own character flaws to our representatives. And now we have to turn that objective checklist we spent so much time crafting and apply it to our own lives. The personal maturity test, an honest reckoning. Let's revisit the qualification checklist, that objective measure we set for Congress. Now, let's apply it not to a 500-page bill, but to your average Tuesday. 1. Policy depth versus headline. Comfort, the intelligence test. We demanded that politicians read the entire policy, understand the nuance, and avoid the catchy slogan. Do you? When was the last time you read past the headline and the first 3 paragraphs of a news article that genuinely challenged your existing worldview? When was the last time you clicked on a link that took you to a 40-page report and actually dedicated an hour of your life to digesting the technical details of a public policy issue? We demand policy literacy from them, but we settle for a 4-word meme or an 8-second video from a partisan source for ourselves. We avoid complexity because complexity requires effort. We are intellectually lazy, and we reward politicians who validate that laziness with simple, easy answers. We demand depth from them, while feeding ourselves a superficial diet of outrage. If we refuse to do the intellectual heavy lifting to understand the problem, why should we be surprised when our representatives do the same? 2. Intellectual humility versus personal ego. The humility test. We demanded that mature politicians admit when they are wrong and allow the opposition to have a good idea. Do you possess that security? Think about your most recent argument: a debate with a coworker over a project deadline, a disagreement with a family member over a dinner plan, or a political fight with a friend on social media. When was the last time you looked your opponent in the eye and said, "You know what? I was wrong about that specific point. Your data is better. Let's change course." The inability to utter that phrase, "I was wrong," is the root of all congressional gridlock. If you cannot admit a mistake in a low-stakes argument about who left the dishes out, how can you expect your representative to admit a mistake in a high-stakes argument about a trillion-dollar budget? We confuse intellectual surrender with personal weakness. We reward self-righteous rigidity in our own lives, and then we elect leaders who are masters of that same rigid performance. They are simply mirroring the inflexible ego we nurture every single day. 3. Long-term focus versus short-term comfort. The maturity test. We demanded that politicians take difficult, painful steps today for a generational benefit tomorrow. How are you doing with your own long-term focus? Do you avoid the painful, necessary tasks in your life that demand maturity? Do you put off creating a budget? Do you defer the uncomfortable medical visit that you know needs to happen? Do you choose the instant gratification of junk food and television over the long-term benefit of health and exercise? The avoidance of short-term pain for long-term gain. That's immaturity. Gridlock is simply the political version of procrastination. The debt ceiling debate, the failure to address climate change, the inability to fix infrastructure. These are all politically painful tasks that require a legislator to swallow a bitter pill today for the benefit of the nation 10 years from now. If we, as individuals, constantly choose the sugar rush of instant gratification, why do we expect our representatives to act like generational stewards? Our elected officials are not failing the nation. They are passing our personal immaturity test with flying colors. The selfish baby. This is where the political dysfunction becomes deeply personal. We have created a political culture that rewards the selfish baby. The selfish baby is the person in any environment who demands total emotional and political satisfaction without compromise, consequence, or effort. When you look at the worst behaviors in Washington, the constant interruptions, the personal insults, the refusal to negotiate, the legislative tantrum aimed at obstruction or using disinformation tactics until their exact, specific demand is met, that is the behavior of a child who never learned the word no and never had to share their toys. The evolution of the crying tactic. At first, this kind of extreme, selfish crying might have earned limited attention, a momentary spike in a poll or a small fundraising haul, but as the American public became more jaded, more polarized, and more convinced the government couldn't work, the selfish crying tactic gained traction. Today, we are inundated by disingenuous calls to action from political commentators and podcasting royalty. If we break down the ask, we see that we are no longer crying about real, nuanced policy issues. Instead, we are captured by constant ad hominem attacks and the politics of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. This tactic works because it bypasses the logical brain and engages the primitive fight-or-flight response, validating our personal emotional grievances. And what do we, the citizens, do? We stand on the sidelines and cheer for the tantrum because we feel validated. When your representative demonizes the other side and rejects any compromise as a betrayal, they are telling you, "I will fight for 100% of what you want, and I will treat the opposition like the enemy they are." That emotional rush feels incredible because it feeds our own inner selfish babies who is tired of compromise, tired of sharing, and tired of the complexity of reality. We are demanding to be represented by people who reflect our own worst impulses. We are demanding the performance of maturity from a leader, while rewarding the behavior of immaturity in our own lives and in the voting booth. This is why the crisis is a crisis of the electorate's character. The true battle is not good versus evil. Setting aside the issues with the current administration, which really are in my estimation a truly epic battle between good and evil, when it comes to the rest of us, statistical analysis shows that nearly all of us, regardless of political stripe, want to create a better world for ourselves and our kids. We need to divest ourselves of the notion that we are fighting some epic, irreconcilable battle between pure good and absolute evil. We are all just regular, ordinary citizens trying to figure out what it means to compromise and what our country needs in order to succeed. Though we may like to think otherwise, we all have a natural, hardwired handicap when it comes to trying to understand views that we don't already believe in. We have to overcome that biological tendency towards self-validation and seek the mature middle ground, both in our homes and in our politics. The great American experiment, that delicate, fragile commitment to self-governance that allowed us to build bridges, fight fires cooperatively, and feed the world, is based on the assumption that the citizens would exhibit a higher degree of maturity than the average authoritarian state demands. It assumed we would police our own egos, compromise in the messy middle, and reward quiet, boring competence. We have broken that contract, not with a sudden revolution, but with a gradual, emotional, and intellectual surrender. The gridlock isn't a political system failure. It's a collective failure of character. The solution, therefore, doesn't begin in Washington. It begins with the person you see in the mirror. Segment 6, Personal Solutions and the Path Forward. We started this episode by examining the majestic, improbable feat of human cooperation, the long march from the lone caveman to a global superpower. As we go through this, I keep hearing people refer to the political system as the American experiment. But what we are truly involved in, what we've been building for tens of thousands of years, is the experiment of human civilization. And the evidence is abundant. We are, at our core, a nonviolent, hardworking, collaborative, honorable species. We, the overwhelming majority, want what is best for our species. We want to eradicate suffering, and we want to explore and keep learning what this all is, and whether we can create true meaning for what we find ourselves involved in. The gridlock we see is not a failure of this grand experiment. It is an aberration, a momentary lapse of maturity in a political system that is designed to be the greatest tool our species ever invented. Re-emphasize the founders' faith. When the founders established this system over 200 years ago, I don't think they were only blindly handing over this enormous responsibility. I think they were making a calculated bet on what the fundamental truth about the nature of humanity itself. The truth some of us are only discovering today, that the vast majority of us are selfless. We desire collaboration, we value stability, and, given the power, we would choose competence over chaos. This entire political design is a tribute to the potential of the human spirit. The only thing standing in the way of achieving that potential is our own failure to uphold the standards of personal maturity that the system demands. The gridlock ends not with a massive protest, but with a series of quiet, individual decisions. The solution is twofold: the personal maturity pledge and the structural reframe. The personal maturity pledge. The inner work. First, you must choose to actively retire your own inner selfishness. This week, commit to just one of these acts of personal civic maturity. Read the mechanism. Instead of accepting a headline, spend 30 minutes researching the details of a political topic from a source you trust, and then spend another 10 minutes reading a credible summary of the opposing viewpoint. Intellectual maturity requires friction. The compromise test: find a low-stakes conflict in your personal life, a plan with a friend, a task at work, a dispute with a family member, and commit to resolving it not with total victory, but by actively seeking the 70% solution. Voluntarily give up the final 30% of what you wanted and call it a win for collaboration. We have to practice compromise before we can demand it. Reward boredom. When you see a local candidate who is talking about the boring, necessary logistics of municipal sewage, bond allocation, or zoning reform, support that person. Show the political marketplace that maturity is now the premium trait. The structural reframe. The peaceful revolution. The outer work. Secondly, we initiate a peaceful revolution. We need to admit that the lack of quality choices isn't accidental, it's by design. The power structures, often backed by wealthy interest groups, invest massive resources into candidate selection, actively reducing the pipeline of mature, qualified problem solvers. They want the two extreme options they can control. Our revolution is simple. We bypass the machine by running ourselves. The old model of running for office, endless fundraising, kissing rings, taking time off work, is obsolete. We are calling for an era of zero campaign candidacy. How to run for office with a 9-to-5 job. Post your profile, the digital resume, dedicate a website, blog, or simple social media account to your candidacy. You don't need a campaign office. Use your lunch hour to post one single, detailed policy paper that outlines your view and your proposed mechanism for solving an issue. Use your existing professional experience as your executive qualifications. Use free media, the podcast blog. Start a podcast where you spend 15 minutes a week reading and summarizing a complex piece of nonpartisan legislation or data, the equivalent of the reading homework your representative should be doing. Let your content prove your policy intelligence. Constituent engagement. The after-hours pledge. Pledge to only engage with citizens who contact you with genuine questions about your policy positions. Use your evenings or weekends to answer emails and hold online town halls. This shows your commitment is to substance, not spectacle. This mechanism is a write-in candidacy movement that puts the power back into the hands of qualified, ordinary people. The solution is not to wait for the perfect candidate to appear, it is for qualified people like you, the engineer, the teacher, the small business owner, to put your name on the ballot and let your publicly demonstrable maturity and policy literacy speak for itself. You use the tools of the modern digital age to bypass the bureaucracy of candidate selection, funding, and television advertising. Tools for building policy intelligence. Finally, to fulfill the pledge, here are a few objective resources you can use right now to elevate your policy intelligence. Congressional Research Service, CRS. Reports. The CRS provides nonpartisan analysis on complex issues, e.g., healthcare, energy, trade. These reports are objective summaries written for Congress, making them the ultimate source of policy literacy. C-SPAN, watch unedited, raw footage of committee hearings, floor debates, and town halls. This is essential for applying the mute the sound maturity test and identifying which politicians are engaged in sober debate versus performance. Nonpartisan think tanks, e.g., Brookings Institution, Cato Institute, Urban Institute, these organizations publish deep, data-driven analysis on policy proposals. The key is to read the analysis from multiple opposing think tanks on the same issue to gain true intellectual humility and depth. The great, fragile American experiment is not ending due to foreign invasion or constitutional defect. It is ending because we, the sovereign citizens, have stopped upholding the personal standard of maturity required to make it work. The solution to the crisis in Washington, D.C. is not in electing a better leader. The solution is in becoming a better, more mature, and more intellectually honest citizen, and being willing to become the change we demand. The change begins, not on the Senate floor, but in the person you see in the mirror. Thank you for listening.